and thank you. Welcome to the Americans and the Holocaust. This is an exhibition brought to the Fresno County Public Library by the American Library Association and the Holocaust Memorial Museum. We are very fortunate to have this exhibition at our library. We were one of 50 libraries in the country that were selected. We are the only public library in California that was selected. The other library in California selected was the UC Irvine Academic Library. So we're very, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. This is a part of our series of supportive programming that we put together with our community partners to help the community really process the information that was being presented at the exhibition. These programs have touched on local history, they've touched on world history, and they've really just been a wonderful opportunity for us to come together as a community to learn more about this period in history. After our speakers share their stories, we welcome everybody to come downstairs again and experience the exhibition. We also have a lot of staff members handy to help you get a library card. If anybody here doesn't have a library card and would like to use their library card to say check out information, books, and movies about this period in history, we can help you with that as well. But today's program, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand the microphone over to our moderator for today, Marta. Thank you.
My name is Valjean Simonian, and I'll be the moderator today for the panel discussion for the survivor stories. This is the fourth event of the series of the events we're having that the community about 2 years ago put it together, including Japanese Americans, and the library put the whole program together with the leadership of Faye. Thank you so much, Faye. I have been honored to serve on this local organizing committee who came up with a program complementing the touring exhibition that are relevant to Fresno, inviting Holocaust survivors to their stories. I also want to thank the committee to encouraging and inviting the Armenian genocide survivors to share their family stories. It is known that Hitler used the Armenian genocide as his inspiration and model to carry out the Jewish Holocaust. The word genocide was coined by Raphael Lomkin, a professor of law at Yale University. It was based on his studies of a Turkish attempt to annihilate the Armenian people, following by the atrocity of Hitler and Nazis carrying against the Jewish people. It combines two Greek words, genos, meaning race, and xido, meaning kill, so genocide. It was universally adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1949. It is one thing really to read stories, books, or documents about the Holocaust, about genocide or atrocity. It's a completely different thing to see and hear directly from those who survived. That's why we have these survivor stories to you. We are lucky to have them here. They will share their family story, and you will feel that you have the opportunity at the end of it to ask questions. We have 5 panelists. The first panelist, Eva Mieden. Eva was born in Vienna, Austria. She was very young when the Nazis overtook Austria, but was very vivid memory and was often in conversation with her family about the events. She immigrated to the United States in 1940. Eva had a long career in mental health, including 25 years of social service for Holocaust survivors residing in San Francisco Bay Area. Please welcome Eva.
Thank you, Varjun. Can you hear me? I'm really gratified to be here with you today as you explore the exhibit, especially because it contains the story of my family's journey. Both the exhibit and my story demonstrate the way fascism rises. The dictionary definition of fascism is supremacy of one national or ethnic group, a contempt for democracy, and an insistence on obedience to a powerful leader. In the 1930s, my parents, Simon and Antonio Wenkart, were both physicians in Vienna, Austria, and had a secure life. My brother Helmut was born first, and I came along 5 years later. We lived in a large apartment which combined each of their medical offices with our living quarters. The neighborhood was primarily Jewish, which led to it being named the Matzah Island. It was distressing to the Jewish community in Austria that so many Austrians had joined the Austrian branch of the National Socialist or Nazi Party, which Hitler had started in Germany in 1933. My parents knew the Nazis were in power there, using propaganda against the Jews and extreme restrictions on their daily lives. Nonetheless, it was a great shock when Nazi troops entered Vienna in March of 1938 to a huge welcoming turnout of Austrian supporters. The takeover was called the Anschluss. Immediately afterwards, a national vote was held to annex Austria to Germany, with the Nazis supervising the voting booths and beating up any dissenters. Austria was now Germany. On the day of the Anschluss, my nanny dressed me in my best clothes, telling me there was a wonderful parade going on. She took me into the living room of our apartment to say goodbye to my parents. My mother was furious and shouted that I was not to go outside today. I could tell that something big and terrible was happening. The laws against the civil and human rights of Jews in Germany had been developed over a 5-year period, and you'll hear more about that from Hannah. These same laws were passed within 6 months in Austria, not 5 years. The Austrian police complied willingly. In the first week of occupation, the government carried out a law prohibiting Jews from holding positions in the government. My father had a half-time job as a public health physician. When he showed up for work, he was cruelly dismissed that day. The family myth has it that his hair turned white overnight. He was 42 years old. My papers are a little mixed up here. The major plan of the Nazis had for the Viennese Jews in 1938 was to pressure them to emigrate. This was before the actual genocide. My 8-year-old brother Helmut was harassed by a Nazi teacher in his classroom. The policeman who had helped children cross the street at my brother's school was now also serving the Nazis. A few months after the Anschluss, all Jewish children were expelled from school. My brother was even under arrest for a day when our clueless nanny took him to play in the park near a sign saying, "No Jews allowed." He was seriously abused before being released to my desperate mother. Within a week of the Anschluss, my father received a phone call from a patient of his who happened to be the secretary of the Viennese police headquarters. She said, "Herr Dr. Wenkart, you have to hide immediately. I'm typing up a list of socialists and Jews to be arrested, and your name is on it." My father immediately thought of his friend, Dr. Lande, a Catholic colleague with whom he often met in the Viennese cafes. Dr. Lande and his wife arranged a hiding place behind their pantry, and my father stayed there whenever he received a warning again. The Nazis had sent an officer named Adolf Eichmann, you've heard of him, to be in charge of the immigration plan and arrest of Jews that had not yet immigrated. In June of 1938, most of the funds belonging to Jewish persons were systematically stolen and transferred to German banks. I've seen the document my parents had to fill out describing their assets, which were then stolen. When a Jewish man was arrested, he might end up in jail, or be sent to Dachau concentration camp, which already existed, though it was not at that time a killing camp. People did die there, though. However, if a family member could produce documents proving that he was ready to leave Austria, a man was released to emigrate. Women were less targeted in those days. My mother had to close her practice after Jewish doctors were deprived of their licenses. However, when a scarlet fever epidemic occurred in the spring, she made up her mind to visit sick children, no matter what the consequences might be. She put together a large black bag for medical supplies, but it looked like a purse. In this way, she was able to save the lives of sick Jewish children. While my father stayed out of sight, my mother began to seek a way for us to get out of Vienna. She took me with her when she went to various consulates to try to get visas for the family's escape. I remember well long lines, the desperate expressions on people's faces, and my aching feet. We would stand on a different line each day. None of our efforts succeeded. On December 9th, a carefully planned, huge pogrom occurred in Germany, and now Austria, of course, was also called Germany, and it occurred in Vienna as well. During that time, all but one of the synagogues in Vienna were burned down. The firemen did nothing except stand around in case any one of the adjacent buildings might catch fire. Most Jewish businesses were ransacked and defaced, and men on the street were arrested. After this terror, my mother's cousin, Zvi Taubes, the rabbi of the conservative synagogue in Zurich, Switzerland, made up his mind to rescue the family. He offered my mother flight tickets to Switzerland and the necessary affidavits of support. My parents were more than ready to accept. On our last day in Vienna, I had a hard time packing the small amount we were allowed to take. Should I pack Pooh the bear or Emily, my beloved doll? My mother was busy sewing some jewelry into the clothing I was to wear on the airplane. The instructions she gave me were, be sure not to be touched by any guards. Jewish refugees could carry very little money. She hoped to sell the jewelry in Zurich later. I didn't know at that time that my father was very ill with appendicitis. It had not been safe for him to go to any hospital in Vienna, not even the ones where he had been a doctor himself. At the airport, we boarded the plane to Switzerland safely. When we landed, to my surprise, there was an ambulance waiting for my father. My mother explained that he was to have an appendectomy right away. It was to take about 6 months in a Swiss nursing home for him to recover from the delayed operation. My mother, brother, and I had a brief stay in a guest house as arranged by our cousin. When my mother visited the Swiss Jewish Agency for Refugees, the only housing they could offer was a room for 2 persons in the home of a Swiss family. She repeated there were 3 of us, but nothing was available. She would have to put either me or my brother in an orphanage for the time being. She made the excruciatingly difficult choice to place my 8-year-old brother there. We lived with a kindly family, but food was not part of the arrangement. Sometimes I took to bringing toys to the kitchen while our hostess was cooking dinner, knowing that then they would be likely to invite me to eat. After about a half a year, our hostess, who was now very attached to me, decided to add 2 more mattresses on the floor of our room so that my father and brother could join us. The Swiss did not allow refugees to work or to be on a path to citizenship. In spite of this, my mother began to work illegally in a candy factory, bringing home pockets full of chocolate to supplement our meager diet. My father was busy studying English. Over a year passed. The Swiss Immigration Agency conducted monthly meetings with my mother, interrogating her harshly as to why she had not left her temporary stay in Switzerland. When are you getting out? She always took me with her, and I remember how I felt when she was mistreated. Finally, relatives of each of my parents who had already gotten into the United States were able to help us. My father's two brothers, who had been rescued by a synagogue in Providence, Rhode Island, campaigned for them to bring us as well. My mother's sister, who had arrived in New York after her release from a Nazi prison, campaigned with several Jewish agencies to provide us with ship tickets. Finally, we were able to travel to Italy. We enjoyed a pleasant visit with my grandmother, who had escaped to Milan. Her candlesticks are standing in our display area. I was sad, and my father even cried because we could not take her with us when we got on the ship. To me, the situation was frightening because the men in black shirts looked like Nazis. We sailed on the SS Rex in March of 1940. It was the last time a passenger ship to America left an Italian port until after the war. Arriving in New York was a happy time for us, yet there was a shadow on our joy with relatives left behind. We settled in New York's Washington Heights neighborhood. My parents were studying diligently for 2.5 years while we lived on refugee welfare funds. My brother and I learned English quickly and helped our parents with the language. When they could practice medicine again, they eventually opted to train further and became psychoanalysts. The field was in its heyday, and after all, they had attended Sigmund Freud's lectures while in medical school in Vienna. Both Simon and Antonia promoted new theories which took into account the social conditions that were influential in a person's development. I guess I followed their example with a career in mental health and with raising 2 sons. Thank you for your kind attention.
Our next speaker is Jack Baninga. Jack recounts his family's experience during World War II. The Baninga family had lived in Netherlands for over 200 years. Facing extinction when Germany overtook the homeland in 1940, they managed to escape Holland just hours after Germany invaded. Their subsequent travels covered 3 continents and halfway around the world from 1940 to 1945, ending in their imprisonment for 2.5 years in Japanese prisoner of war camps in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. The family they left behind in Holland was decimated. Jack? Today, I was wondering what tie I'm going to wear. All of a sudden, I remember some 20 years ago when I was in Holland, I bought this tie. I said, this is from Jack's family's memory.
Good afternoon. Okay. So I want to talk to you about a sort of unusual set of experiences for Jews. I got most of this. I was born after the war in 1948. I'll talk a little bit about that. But each of my parents wrote a book about their war experiences because when we were kids, they really didn't talk much about it. So I'm just going to recount their story. So it was November 1933 when Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and that's the year my parents became engaged. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, and I think Hannah's going to talk a little bit about that progressively restricted the lives of German Jews. And that's the year my father received his PhD in chemistry. And in 1937, my parents were married, and in 1939, my sister was born. Throughout that time, there was a depression in the world, jobs were difficult to come by, and the world situation was getting worse. Tensions were high, the German threat was ominous, people didn't know what to do. In May of 1940, May 10th, Germany attacked Holland and Belgium and France. My parents, in the meantime, with my one set of grandparents, had moved from where they lived in northern Holland in Groningen to a place much closer to the coast, thinking that they might have to leave quickly. So there were two families basically living in the house on the coast, my parents and my grandparents. My father worked about 90 miles away, and my grandfather had a store in Groningen, also about 90 miles away. And so the plan was for all the women to stay on the coast, and the men would come on the weekends. They would work someplace and come on the weekends back. So that was the plan, except it didn't quite work well because Germany attacked during the week. My father was able to make it back. My grandfather was not able to make it back. Big argument ensued. My grandmother said, "I'm not leaving without my husband." My mother said, "I'm not leaving without my mother said, "I'm not leaving without my mother." And then on the evening of May 11th, some friends came to visit my father, and my grandmother saw them give him a vial of cyanide powder because my father had said, "I'm not going to be taken alive by the Germans. I'm not going to live under them." So my grandmother said, when she saw that, said, "Okay, I'll go." And then my mother said, "I'll go," and they left. So they made the decision to leave. On the 12th of May, so 2 days later after Holland was taken over, the Queen announced that she had left Holland. I won't talk, there's so many stories I won't say. Anyway, my parents and this other family that lived with them went to the coast. They were living on the coast. That's why they lived there in the first place. And they tried to find a ship to take them somewhere out of Holland. And they went from ship to ship, and they couldn't turn around. Anyway, they finally found a fishing trawler. It took 40 hours to go from the coast of Holland to England, to Folkestone, England, where they landed. They could not stay in England. They were there, couldn't stay. England would not allow foreigners to stay in England if they wouldn't allow them to work. And this is a young couple. They had to work. They tried to get visas for Australia. They couldn't get it. And coincidentally, the Dutch government in exile was stationed in London. And they told my father the following story. They said on the day that Germany attacked Holland, 6,000 Dutch Nazis were living in Indonesia, and they arrested them all. And most of them were academics and professionals. And they said, "Well, you have a PhD in chemistry, so there'll be lots of jobs for you if you go to the Dutch East Indies." So they went. So 6 weeks after they got to England, they left. They departed Southampton. I have a little map, but it's too small for you to see. Anyway, from England, around the Cape of Good Hope, they had to dodge enemy ships along the way, and finally made it to Perth, Australia, and then eventually made it to Indonesia, and that was 7 weeks on a boat, and it was a rough trip. They landed in Surabaya, in Indonesia. Or Dutch East Indies. My father found a job in various labs, and then in a technical college where he taught chemistry. And they lived there for a year. This was in 1940, actually a year and a half, and it was a very pleasant life with not much. They didn't get much news, but it was a pleasant life for them. And then December 7th came, December 7th, 1941. Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and joined the Axis powers. And later on, the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies. So a couple of months later, in March of 1942, Japan imprisoned all the foreign civilians, mostly men. So my father didn't come home one day. My mother didn't hear from him anymore for 2.5 years or more. And then so she lived for about 9 months with my grandmother and my sister in Indonesia. And then in the spring of 1943, all the Dutchmen, I've got so many stories. But here's a kind of funny story. The Japanese couldn't figure out the Jewish issue. And so they arrested people who were white and Jewish, but not the Germans or the Hungarians or the Austrians or the Italian Jews, because they were allies of Germany, even though the Jews were there and they had escaped, but they couldn't figure that out. But my parents weren't one of those. So they were imprisoned. So many of they spent from 1943 to 1946 in Japanese camps. No, it was not at all like the German camps where people were executed, but many, many people died of malnutrition and dysentery. Jews were mixed with everyone else. But over the time, the Japanese figured something out, and they ended up in all Jewish camps in Indonesia. My sister was in the camps from age 4.5 till about the age of 7, did not grow at all, and actually lost weight over that time. My grandmother, who was a stocky woman before the war, weighed 68 pounds when she got out. And my mother had edema caused by hunger and was very, very swollen. So in 1945, the camps were liberated. The Red Cross came through with postcards, and people could write to their loved ones. But how do you write to someone if you don't know where they are? So my mother wrote to my father using his prison number. Everybody, like the Germans, they didn't get tattoos, but they all had prison numbers. So she wrote to my father using his prison number, and that apparently worked. And they were then reconciled. They were separated in March of 1942, and they were reconciled in September of 1945. They met again. And it was only in 1945 that they actually found out what had happened in Europe while they were gone. They had no idea. It really wasn't broadcast. And in 1946, they left and went back to Holland. I was going to tell you some stories. I think I'm running out of time, and I want to show you a short video. But a couple of things. In the camps, one story from my father and one story from my mother. In the camps, my father taught chemistry to two 15-year-old kids. And he had a porcelain plate, and he could write on the back of the plate, then you could wash it in the porcelain. And if he had a pencil, you could erase it. Anyway, he taught these 15-year-old kids. And then, the war was over and he didn't see them. 40 years later, he was in the hospital in Jerusalem. He had leukemia. And there was a knock on the door, and the chair of the hematology department came in and said, "Are you the?" I remember. Anyway, he was the kid that he had taught in the camps. One of them all that time ago. My mother told the story, sort of like the one you're going to see in a minute. People died of starvation in the camps. So there was a woman. Everybody had mattresses. They were bug-infested mattresses, and they slept on dirt. So a woman died of starvation in the camp. They took her out and rolled up her mattress. And what she had done, apparently, is dug a little hole in the clay under her mattress and collected grains of rice that she kept under the mattress. And when they rolled out the mattress and took it away, two women immediately came and started fighting over the grains of rice that had been under the mattress in the red clay for however long time ago. And this is a memory that stayed with her and stayed with me. Let me just finish with this. I just want to tell you what happened with the Dutch Jews. In Holland in 1930, so before Hitler came to power, there were about 112,000 Jews in all of Holland. By 1941, there were about over 150,000. So 40,000 more than before. Why? Because people tried to escape from the German-occupied countries, and they came to Holland, or many of them came. One that came, I heard this discussed this morning, was Anne Frank. And that's how her parents were from Germany, and they came to Amsterdam. Coincidentally, my grandmother's name, the grandmother that was in the picture, was also Anna Frank, but no relation. So there were about 150,000 Jews in 1941, and by 1947, there were 14,346 Jews left. About 90% of all the Jews in Holland didn't exist, were murdered. What happened was, beginning in around 1942, Dutch Jews were rounded up, sent to local communities, and they were then sent to central deportation area in Holland called Westerbork. And from Westerbork, they were sent to various concentration camps. So the way this worked is in Westerbork, every Tuesday morning from July 1942 to September 1944, so for 26 months, an estimated is about 100,000 Jews were deported in those 2 years. And they were sent to Auschwitz mostly. All my relatives mostly died in Auschwitz. Sobibor, Theresienstadt, and Bergen-Belsen. My mother, in her book, luckily her grandson is a PhD in history, and he documented there are 128 people, direct relatives of my parents, who died in World War II, who died in the gas chambers in the concentration camp, not just in World War II. So what I wanted to do is and I'm going to finish up in a minute, I just want to mention 4 of those. This picture was on my aunt's in Amsterdam, her coffee table, forever until she died, and then I got it. This is a man whose name is Jacques Dasberg. He was her fiance. He was 6 years old. I don't know if you can see it or not, but he's wearing a yellow, it's a yellow star identifying him as a Jew, so it must have been around 1942. And he was 26 years old and was transported from Westerbork to Auschwitz on September 7th, and like most Jews, died within the week, was sent to the gas chambers. My grandfather, who you saw there, who couldn't make it back to join the family and would have escaped with them but couldn't, was transported to Auschwitz from Westerbork on October 19th, 1942. The Germans kept great records, and within a week he was in the gas chamber. And my father's mother died when he was 4 months old. My grandfather had 9 sisters. 2 of those sisters raised my father, so they were essentially his mother. They were Frauke Benninge, age 54, and Henriette Benninge, age 62. They were both transported on November 23rd, 1942, were in Auschwitz for about a week or less, and were murdered there. And they were amongst the 128 of my family who died. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacques. Our next panelist is Hannah Krabs. Most of you probably know her. Hannah Krabs came to the United States from Germany with her parents in 1940 and grew up in New York City. She has lived in Fresno for 65 years, where she and her husband, once Fresno County Supervisor and then influential U.S. Congressman representing our district, the Honorable John Krabs, raised their 2 children, now grown. Over the years, Hannah has been involved in our community, in various organizations, as well as in her synagogue. Please welcome Hannah.
Can you see me? I can sit there too. Should I sit? Okay. I can do it. It was on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, also known as the Night of Broken Glass. I was 15 months old, and my parents were entertaining a group of friends in our home in Augsburg, Germany. Up until this fateful night, the Nazis had been persecuting Jews all over Germany with beatings and severe restrictions on their civil rights, work, education, and living situation. Jews and other undesirables were arrested and sent to concentration camps, which up to that point were said to be work camps. Kristallnacht was an important turning point in the life of the Jews in Germany and for my family. Known as the Nuremberg race laws during the 30s, the goal was to isolate Jews from German society with edicts handed down every week and every day, restricting them from shopping at certain times during the day, using public transportation, attending schools, and of course having to wear at all times the yellow star on the left side of their clothing. We were no longer German citizens, even though my family had lived there for generations and were very much integrated into German society. People were not allowed to frequent Jewish shops or businesses, and Jewish doctors or lawyers could no longer practice. As a matter of fact, my husband and his family lived in Berlin, where John's father was a dentist, and saw his practice decline as these edicts were enforced. As early as 1933, when Hitler was elected, John's father saw the handwriting on the wall, and with his wife and 2 sons emigrated to Israel. The rest of the family thought he was crazy, believing, as many did at that time, that this will all blow over. Sadly, many of them perished in the camps. My family had a successful men's clothing and woolen manufacturing company in Augsburg, but were forced to sell it to someone for pennies. Then, of course, came Kristallnacht, and my father and the other men in our home were taken to Dachau. This was the first concentration camp established by the Nazis in 1933, mainly for what was called political prisoners, Romas or Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men, and any opponents of the regime. The town of Dachau was a short distance from Munich, where it is believed over 40,000 prisoners perished and remained as such until the end of the war. After a while, my mother received a handwritten postcard from my father stating that he is fine and doesn't need any money. Included are printed instructions on how to send a postcard and not to send packages, since prisoners can buy everything they need. These are, of course, all lies and deceptions. Amazingly, I still have this postcard with the original Dachau stamp, and it's over there on the table I have with some other things that you might want to look at. It, too, is in the exhibit there, which I just mentioned. And it's also my mother's passport and my passport, showing another interesting edict established during the Nuremberg laws. Every Jewish girl had to be given the middle name of Sarah, and every Jewish boy the name Israel. Obviously, another way of identifying them. Another Jewish or Nazi policy during the 30s was to force Jews to leave Germany if they had legal papers and a place to go, but eventually decided that forced immigration was not a viable solution towards their goal of making Germany judenfrei. My family could also see what was happening. So sometime before Kristallnacht, my father traveled to New York to see a cousin who had generously agreed to sponsor our family, which was an absolutely necessary requirement by the U.S. government under their very restrictive immigration quotas. And you can see all of that, which is the focus of the exhibit, is downstairs. The paperwork and red tape would naturally take a while, but we did have some official documents that showed we would eventually be able to obtain visas and leave. The day after my father was arrested, my mother went to the consulate in Munich, stood online all day, and after verifying the papers, the authorities agreed to release my father after 3 months. We knew we urgently had to leave, but where would we go since our visas to enter the United States had not yet arrived? It so happens that on Kristallnacht, my grandmother and grandfather were in Baden-Baden, a small resort town in Germany where the people love to go to relax in the spas and salt baths. My husband and I had visited this many, many years ago. He took one of them, but I wasn't going near them. My grandfather was also arrested on that night, but was released after he and many other of the men were taunted and made to march in line through the town holding a large Jewish star. I also have an original picture of him. He's at the head of the line, holding with another gentleman this very large Mogen David. You can see that on the display also. Naturally, he immediately returned to Augsburg and let my family know that while he was in Baden-Baden, he had met a wonderful family from Manchester, England, who, seeing what was going on, had invited him to come and stay with them if they needed a place to go. At that point, my grandparents didn't have visas or exit papers, but after my father was released and our exit papers finally arrived, we traveled to Manchester to live with the Jacksons for the next 8 months until our New York visas were issued. These wonderful people saved our lives, and we are forever grateful to them and other families who risked their lives to help Jews during these times. On January 3rd, 1940, we arrived in New York to start our new lives in America. We were certainly grateful to be free and to escape with our lives, but it was not easy for my parents and other refugee families I knew. Having to leave everything behind, learn a new language, earn a living, and adjust to a new way of life and significantly deal with the trauma of the Holocaust affected everyone differently. Over the years, I wish I had asked more questions about their experiences, but a common thread I've found running through survivors is that they don't really want to talk about it. Fortunately, we have so much documentation from survivors, books, wonderful museums all over the world, so that we can never forget. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Nazik Musaryan. Nazik's parents were survivors of the Armenian genocide of 1915-1923. They ended up in Kharkov, Ukraine, where Nazik and her sister Vartiter were born. As a youngster, she grew up under communist regime, while her parents were experiencing Soviet atrocities. From 1941 to 43, Kharkov was occupied by Nazi Germany. Upon their defeat, her family, along with other echelons, was zigzagged through dozens of locations to German proper. Wartime years from 1943 to 1945, she experienced living in military barracks under heavy bombardment by Allied forces. With the help of ANCHA, the American National Committee to Aid Homeless Armenians, she immigrated to the United States in 1949. Please welcome.
As you can see by the introduction, I think I'm the oldest dinosaur in this room. Initially, I was to deliver my own speech, but because of some unexpected changes, I have asked one of my grandchildren to deliver the speech for me, and you're in luck. He is much, much better looking than I am. And also, I take pride in introducing him as a very intelligent, a third-generation doctor-to-be. What do I say? He's one of the best. Here's my grandson. What's your name? Gregory. Gregory will do my speech.
As she said, I'm one of her grandchildren. I'm her 9th grandchild, and I'll be reading this on her behalf. Dear friends, I'd like to thank Fresno's Jewish community for inviting me to share my story. I commend you for being inclusive and for recognizing the Armenian genocide, its importance in history, and its relevance today. Today, I will offer you my personal and family history. These will be stories of the past, stories heard and passed on, but stories with lessons for all generations, young and old alike. I am not a historian, but throughout my presentation, I will be providing my understanding of world events to provide context to my own journey. For 3,000 years, the Armenian people lived in the Armenian highlands, what is now modern-day Turkey. During this time, the Armenian people developed and maintained a distinct ethnic identity within this region. In the 11th century, the nomadic Turkic tribes of Central Asia, having expanded westward towards the Middle East, occupied Armenia proper. This Turkish dominion eventually morphed into the Ottoman Empire, which ruled enormous territory ranging from Asia Minor, Europe, Northern Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. For centuries, under Turkish rule, the Armenian people prospered under foreign rule and kept its cultural, religious, and ethnic identity. In the late 19th century, the concept of pan-Turkism emerged, with the idea of unifying all Turkic people across multiple continents. With the Armenian population as the main non-Turkic and non-Muslim people within its empire, the Ottoman Empire set about to make pan-Turkism a reality by eliminating the Armenian people. This culminated in the first ethnic cleansing of the 20th century, the 1915 genocide of the Armenians. The vast majority of Armenians living in their millennia-old lands were either exterminated or forcibly removed by mass deportation. The horrific stories of torture, incomprehensible barbarism, and mass extermination need not to be recounted here. This audience is well aware of what brutality humans are capable of inflicting on other human beings. My parents were survivors of that genocide. 6-year-old Khangui, my mother, was born in the multi-ethnic city of Ordu on the Black Sea. When Turkish hordes overtook Ordu, Armenian families were flushed out of their homes and the men were killed. The unprotected elderly, women, and children were made to march to the Syrian desert. My mother's 6-month-old twin siblings were snatched from their cribs. My mother was separated from her family and left behind. The orphaned young girl was at the mercy of good-willed people who took her in to do chores with the intent of Turkifying her. In 1918, after the armistice, she ended up in an orphanage. Later, survivor family members found and took her to Sukhumi, Abkhazia, and then to Kharkov, Ukraine. My father was born in the Armenian plateau in the village of Zitoch. His name was Hovagim, which is the Armenian name of the biblical name Joachim, and he was the eldest of 9 siblings. As a teenager, he left home to escape Ottoman conscription, which was a virtual death sentence for young Armenian men. Soon after he left, all Armenians, including my father's family, were killed. Young men like Hovagim, who had left in search of work to support their families, returned to the horror of the murder of their families. My father joined the volunteer freedom fighters. When the dust of World War I settled, with world powers finalizing the fate of the Armenian nation, and with no home to go to, my father went to Kharkov to join other village survivors. Hovagim and Khangui met in Kharkov and were blessed with 2 daughters, my sister Vartiter and I. But Soviet rule was also unkind to our family. In 1937, my father was among those punished and imprisoned by Stalin. After enduring barbaric torture, he was a walking skeleton, not worthy of a crust of bread, a train ride to Siberia, or a bullet. And in 1939, he was released due to the shifting political landscape. World War II began in 1939, and in 1941, when I was 8 years old, Germany occupied Kharkov. Having long been oppressed by the Soviet regime, the people of Kharkov welcomed the Germans as liberators, but that did not last long. German soldiers plundered the city, stripping civilians of their belongings. They forcefully took young men and women from their homes and shipped them to Germany to work in undermanned factories and fields. The city of Kharkov, bombed, pillaged, and paralyzed, faced hunger, brutality, and death. And there was no water. my sister and I walked the streets with buckets in search of trickling faucets. In Kharkov, the large presence of Jews disappeared. There were killings in the streets, and even some Armenians, taken for Jews, were hung from their balconies. While in the outskirts of cities, my grandmother saw a larger area shaking. It was a pit where Jews who had been shot were dumped and covered with soil, dead or alive. Jews were persecuted, tortured, and killed just for being Jewish. The stories have been told, and they must continue to be told, so that we remember and do not let this happen again. It was only 30 years earlier that the Turks slaughtered Armenians to make their pan-Turkic ambitions a reality. The unpunished crime and continuous denial paved the road for other atrocities. When Adolf Hitler was questioned by his top men about the fate of the Jews, he said, "Our war aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus shall we gain the living space which we need." Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Following the German occupation, Kharkov was then recaptured by Russian forces. To replenish military losses, there was immediate conscription, and my father and 4 uncles had to report for duty. My grandmother, a wise woman, advised them to cut their fingers and suck the blood. At the physical exam, the tube inserted into the esophagus would bring up blood, indicating an ulcer which disqualified them from military duty. Thus, they were spared mandatory service. During the tumult of war, Ukrainian national pride, long silenced by Soviet rule, resurfaced, and a Ukrainian school was opened. My sister and I enrolled, and at 9 years old, it was my first formal schooling. We learned the Ukrainian alphabet and folk songs, but 2 weeks later, it was closed. So much for learning. The war was in full swing. In 1943, Germany's defeat at Stalingrad put them on the defensive on the Eastern Front. Their retreat was through Kharkov. In the chaos and the shifting winds of war, many people did not want to continue living under the Russian regime and saw their opportunity with the retreating German military. My father was among those who shared that sentiment. So, perched on bundles of our personal belongings and huddled on open platform railcars, we started our journey to parts unknown. For 9 months, we zigzagged the war front, facing man-made hazards and nature's fury alike. Many a moment were life or death situations. From Kharkov, the cargo trains carried us through cities large and small. Some of them will be familiar to Jewish historians: Poltava, Vinitsa, Grechany, Nikolaev, Kamensky-Podolsk, Proskурov, Bialystok, Lemberg, all with large Jewish communities and, sadly, places of their extermination. We arrived at the barbed wire distribution center camp at Bietigheim, Germany. There, the men, women, and children were separated and herded into large spaces where they were stripped and made ready to shower. There was deafening silence and tension. We knew well the fate of the Jews at German hands, and we thought this might be our end. We were relieved when we were sprayed with water instead of bullets or gas. It seems that, after all, we were a much-needed workforce to support the German war effort and general livelihood of Germany. Incoming people were separated into groups and assigned to different locations or workplaces. Ours was the Daimler-Benz factory at Stuttgart, which was encircled by many labor camps. The military-style camp Flaschenhaus became our home. Both men and women worked at the factory, except for mothers of very young children. Every day, there were numerous bombardments, which meant running a long distance for shelter under heavy shelling. There were many close calls, and death was constantly knocking at our door. With the foresight of our elders, a pit was dug at the center of our camp, where extra clothes and bedding were placed for safety. But it was to no avail. Within days, after heavy bombardment, the camp was burned to the ground. Digging through the ashes, the only thing I could find was my mother's manicure scissors. After intense warfare in 1945, the Allied forces defeated Germany. There was silent chaos, and almost immediately, the labor camps disappeared. The Allied countries, in some ways, stepped in and assisted the homeless masses. In 1947, the organizational meeting for the United Nations took place in San Francisco. Armenian genocide survivor George Mardikyan, who had become a well-known and successful restaurateur, hosted the entire convention and garnered great respect. Once organized, the United Nations actively stepped in and free new camps were created for displaced persons. These camps were largely organized by nationality, and the Armenians, brought by the Germans from different countries, as well as prisoners of war, assembled in Stuttgart at the Bad Cannstatt Funkenkaserne, a former officers' telecommunications camp. Within 2 months, over 2,000 Armenians created a Little Armenia. Repairs were made to the camp, and the new residents quickly organized a small community. First, an Armenian school and church, followed by the establishments of scouts, a sports club, and literary club. We had music and dance ensembles, senior and junior theaters, and workshops. We also had a successful shoe production factory. This displaced persons camp was where I, now 12 years old, received my first grounded schooling. There was an unbelievable sense of dedication and an impressive professional presence of the individuals creating our little village. Although defeated, Germany and Germans still exhibited a strong disdain for the Ausländer, the outsider or foreigner. Even in the hostile environment with no place to go, my father, a man of wisdom and foresight, saw the need for his 2 daughters, my sister and I, to attend a German high school, which we did for 2 years. In 1948, the United States passed the Displaced Persons Act, which brought hope to the stranded homeless people after the war ended. Religious groups and community organizations mobilized first. George Mardikyan, the restaurateur, who had hosted the United Nations just a year prior, had been appointed by President Truman as the chief food consultant for the military bases in Europe. While there, he learned of the Armenians in Stuttgart and immediately visited the camp. On his visit, he was quite moved and proclaimed to his fellow countrymen, "I will not forsake you." After returning to the States, he traveled coast to coast, engaged Armenian communities across the country, and created the American National Committee to Aid Homeless Armenians, or ANCHA. Brilliantly, he fulfilled his promise. ANCHA brought the Armenians of Stuttgart camp, and in the years and decades that followed, thousands of genocide survivors, displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers from Europe and the Middle East came to American shores under the auspices of ANCHA. My family arrived in Sanger on September 9th, 1949. Life was not easy, but as always, the Armenian resilience and tenacity helped us carry on. My parents worked on the farms and in packing houses. So too did my sister and I as high school students, time permitting. For us, there were no handouts, goodwill assistance, or welfare. Education was very important to our family and the bedrock of our success. With determination and great sacrifices, my parents did their utmost and made it possible for us to pursue higher education. Those in our community who were denied of their childhood and deprived of education were proud of our accomplishments. My sister became a medical doctor and I a teacher. To conclude, my sister married Richard Hovanesyan, who became a history professor at UCLA. They were blessed with 4 children. I married Vartkes Masurlian, an Armenian scholar and a civil engineer, and we too were blessed with 4 children. All 8 of them became respectful professionals, and collectively we have 25 intelligent grandchildren, of whom we are very proud. We thank our resilient survivors who nurtured deep, strong roots of the Armenian oak tree and kept our Armenian identity and spirit alive. We thank all who were benevolent, caring, and instrumental to our survival. And we thank you for listening. And in support to my grandmother's story, there are panels over here of visual aid around the room that are worth visiting.
Thank you, Gregory. And thank you, Nazi, for allowing your grandson to speak on your behalf. Our next speaker is Ephraim Hodges. Ephraim was born in Volos, Greece during war. His immediate family survived, jumping through the loops, but his entire extended family, half of them either got killed in Greece and some of them got killed in the camps, while others, they never saw them again. During 1945-49, Greece was in turmoil when communists were trying to expand in Greece. While trying to recover from the consequences of World War II, of economic and natural disaster, the town that they were living in was seriously damaged due to the earthquake. In 1956, with the help of HIASA, Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, the family migrated to the United States. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As he mentioned, my name is Ephraim Hodges. I was born in Volos, Greece. I was born during the war, and growing up, I knew nothing about the war. In 1956, we came to the United States, and going through junior high school and high school, I was asked about the war, so I knew nothing. My parents wouldn't talk about it. The only thing they would say, yes, there was a war, there was a Hitler that killed a lot of people, and that was it. End of story. As I was growing up and realizing that it was more to it, I started poking my father a little bit, and he would say something once in a while. He would say something that occurred, and I could have pieces of what had actually happened. And my mother will say, yeah, you were born in a cave. Finally, pieces got together, and over the years, I've given some lecture, some history of our family, and people ask me, well, on your last speech, you said so-and-so, you didn't say it this time. Well, there was too many pieces to put it all together. I put them down on paper, and I kept on writing, and I realized that it was either too boring for people to listen to the entire story. Well, that was my definition of it. Subsequently to that, I've traveled, gone to Israel, met families that survived during the war that I remember as a kid that were in Greece, and they will say something and they will mention something. For example, in 2003, I believe it was, my wife and I were in Israel, and one of my cousins says, yeah, your mother was counting how many beans each person will receive in their soup in survival during the Holocaust. Like I mentioned, I was born in Volos, Greece. The terrain of the area is similar to Carmel area. You have the sea, a beautiful area, and then you got the mountains. And during the war, after I got my parents to talking and receiving some of the information I could relay now, the rabbi of our town in Volos, who happened to be the head rabbi of Greece, was very friendly with the head priest of the area. And the priest and him will study, because they were both scholars of language, and the first translation of the Hebrew Bible was in Septuagint, which is Greek, ancient Greek, and they would go over words which over the years have changed meaning. So they were very close together. And when the priest found out that they're going to be asking for the Jews to present themselves, for the rabbi to present the names of all the Jews in town, he told them, you better scatter. So we were lucky in Volos. We only lost 26% of the Jewish population, which is a minimum, because Greece was the most lost in percentages. And a lot of people do not read. For example, Salonika was called the Jerusalem of the West. It had 40 yeshivas. The population in Salonika, which is now named Thessaloniki, was primarily Jewish. The port was handled by Jews. It was closed on Saturdays before the war. And during the war, out of the city area in Volos into the countryside, the priest made an announcement in church on a Sunday that you have to take care of your fellow Greeks. Now, my family lived in Greece for over 2,000 years. And that was one thing that my father always instilled in all of us. Don't forget, you're Greek. Your religion, which he never said religion really, because your way of life is Jewish, but you're Greek. Coming to the United States, my father spotted the head of the United Nations, was Wilhelm, I believe it was. He goes, he's a Nazi. I followed the train all the way into Yugoslavia in order to get my mother his mother out of the trains. He got slapped by him, but nobody in the community thought that my father was able to distinguish by then. And we found out later on in life that he was really a Nazi. And it wasn't until the 70s that came out. We jumped from one area to another. My father was very, very precise that you do not, if one of us is caught, you do not tell who the rest of the family is. Each one must survive. His brother was completely the opposite. If one is caught, the whole family should be together. We're going to be in camps to work. And they vanished because he was caught first. His brother, his older brother, Hyman, was caught first, and he told who was his wife and where the children were, and we never seen them again. I never realized a lot of it till it was on Pesach, on Passover Seder. Sometimes when you read the passage that in every generation they come to get us, they would start talking about it. We moved from Volos. Oh, there was an incident there where half of the entire immediate family vanished. From 22, only 11 survived after the war. So, though Volos only lost 26%, my family lost 50%. It is, even now when I talk about it, my memory jumps from one thing to another. I don't want to bore people, but at the same time, I have to tell the story as I received it. And part of it I do remember. I didn't realize that I remembered it until I had children of my own. And when I realized that my daughter in particular will say something that occurred when she was 1 year old, I said, wow, then maybe what I think is hearsay is not really hearsay. Maybe I do remember it. When the Germans came to get my family, my grandmother had me by the hand. They took her. And in conversation with the interpreter, my father walks in with a fish in his hand. He goes, whoa, what's going on here? Well, we came to get, this is a Jewish family. He goes, no, I just came from Athens. This is my partner's family. I brought them a fish. So this is my partner's family. I came to Volos to get cigarettes for the German army because Volos was a packing house for cigarettes. They would roll the cigarettes and, so, And in conversation with him, my mother takes me and my brother, and out of the window we went. Volos subsequently to that, let me back up again. During that particular period, his older brother was taken with his family, and cousins, they went into a cousin where the woman had 9 kids. Well, wait a minute, all these kids are not mine. Go to your houses. And 6 of them survived. The mother and father and the 3 younger ones perished, were never seen again. We left Volos, we went to Athens, and my father would go and rent a place wherever there was a concentration of Germans. Across the street from there, he would rent a place. They're not going to look under their nose for Jews. And with that, they also needed a cook. Guess who cooked for them? My mother. So we had plenty to eat. Now, some of you that heard this story before never heard this catch. It came to me lately as a memory, as my brother and actually my cousin and my entire family took a trip to Greece, and we were talking, we were on the bus talking with my cousin, and he says, I could remember it. I was sitting by the window. I was a little kid, and I was sitting by the window when I seen the Germans take the so-and-so and so-and-so. And that's memory. So like I said before, pieces come together and things happen. I moved to the United States, went to school, went to the Air Force, came back, moved to New York, then moved back to California. And the day that we buried my mother, coming back from New York after burying my mother and coming to Fresno, I received a phone call from the temple in Fresno to Congregation Beth Jacob, which I happened to be I was the president at the time, and I went to make sure that everything was okay. I get a phone call that there's another Greek Jew in town. Oh, okay, give me his name and phone number. He gave me his, I called him. Yeah, I asked him if he spoke Hebrew. He answered me in Hebrew. I told him I don't speak Hebrew, but I spoke Ladino. I spoke to him in Ladino. He answered me in Ladino, and in Greek, he answered me in Greek. So I said, oh, good. So he says, come by, we have a cup of coffee. So I went by before I even home. Because leaving from Congregation Beth Jacob to go to my house, which I live in Madeira, I had to go by his house. So I stopped at his house, we talked, And all of a sudden, he raised his hand, and I seen his tattoo number, 115924. I could never forget them days. January the 15th is when they took my grandmother from my hand. 924 is my sister's birthday. Both named Sarah. Coincidence? Maybe. I don't know. The man had gone through 5 camps. Aaron Abraham was his number and his name, and the tattoo number is registered in Germany. They have it all over the place. He gave me the little thing that I left up there with the electrical as he was getting older, he always asked for me and him, and he reminded me so much of my own father. He was the same character, same Greek, and he would say, "Don't lose it." It specifically states, insulator from Auschwitz, blackened with human ashes. So I could continue, but I think I spoke too long and too much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure every of you at least received something today. Turned off. Oh, there it is. The key here is to be alert on what's going on in the world and respond in a timely manner. Had we done that in 1915, we would avoid the genocide. Had we done that in 1940s, we would avoid the Holocaust. Same thing now. So I urge you to be alert and try to avoid similar thing happening in the future. How much time we have? No, well, in case you folks have a question to our panelists, I was just going to ask you for a few minutes. Then later on, of course, I would definitely urge you to go downstairs. If you have not seen the exhibition, spend the time. Any questions?
The question was, what were the conditions in Austria that made people so ready to join in with the Nazis? After World War I, there was a kind of loss of pride in nationality for the German-speaking nations, of which Austria was one of them, having lost the war. In fact, my father was a medic in World War I. And there was a great deal of poverty, as there also was in the United States. The Big Depression here existed in Austria as well. Another factor was that religious training was permitted in the public schools, and every day children received some religious training. Unfortunately, part of which was that the Jews killed Jesus Christ, something that has now understood very differently since the history was clarified. And so there was a subtle anti-Semitism going on in that regard as well. Those are just a couple of the factors. Thanks for the good question.
Hi, I'd like to first start off by saying that I feel very honored to be here. And my question is, I've noticed that in popular culture, especially around people of my age and of my generation, have started to use the word genocide very freely. And I think that I would like to hear if, like, this is a question for any of you, if you have any words of caution about using the word genocide as it should be, because I've noticed that it's a word that has been increasingly used, especially in ways that I don't think it should be used. So that's what my question is regarding.
Did anyone want to take this, Jack?
Look, I'm no linguist, and we have a linguist sitting in the back. I think what happens with words like this is that they're created and they take a long time because they're so forceful to gain some public understanding, and then they're just corrupted by overuse. And so everybody uses it and this happens not with lots of words that just don't mean what they were originally intended to mean later because they're so pervasively used.
You are correct. If you look at the terminology, what does exactly genocide means? In case of Armenia, when Dr. Lumpkin analyzed it or spelled it out, it's a systematic annihilation of a race from the entire world. Now, if that is happening anywhere else, gotta be a genocide. In case of Armenia, it was not just people, it was culture and homeland. So that's what Lumpkin used it as a base. And then he continues, if you check the website on YouTube, is there questioning this happened to Armenians, and then Hitler used that as a model against the Jews. Those are true models. Now in Cambodia it happened, in Rwanda it happened, we know that. It's happening in Darfur and sometimes on and off. But yes, you are true, we cannot use it lightly. It has to be serious consequences, serious data to back up the terminology. I agree with you.
I'd like to add to this that the word genocide was created by Lepsius, who was a Jewish person. He created that word at the time when there was the Armenian genocide, and geno being, as Varujan stated in the beginning, is the life, and the ending shows the extermination. And it was properly used at that time, as indicated in the introduction. The first genocide of the 20th century was that of the extermination of the Armenians by the Turks, and which was literally, the word literally describes what had happened. In my speech, I had mentioned that the place of the Armenians was a 3,000-year-old homeland of the Armenians. Now, we're not kidding here, that 3,000-year homeland. And when Turks killed the Armenians and settled in Armenia, my terminology is they were the hermit crabs. You know, like the hermit crab looks for a shell and goes into the shell, calls it his own home. That's exactly what the Turks had done. And to do that, they wanted the land without the people. And there were massacres that built up to the point that it became genocide, complete extermination of the people. Over 2 million people killed, and many more were taken to other places. And today, if one were to take a survey, there's not a land in the whole world where you will not find an Armenian. And dare I say, maybe it's also true for the Jewish people, because the extermination, not having homeland. Now, what do I say? The Armenians were completely annihilated. Only the survivors are left. But it was their homeland. It was in their own homeland that this had happened, as opposed to other now called genocides, like in the case of the Jewish people. They were exterminated in the lands that was not their homeland. It was not their homeland, that they were what happened in Germany, in Poland. So there are so many different levels describing genocides. And unless geno, meaning whole, is there, yes, it's an atrocity. It's doing away with people's lives, but there are different classifications. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to view the personal artifacts that were brought here today and the exhibition, but we had one more question in front, I believe. Yeah, sure.
Hi. Like everyone else here, it's been an honor to be able to hear your guys' stories. And if you don't mind me asking, what advice would you give to those wanting to counter the growing anti-Semitism within our nation, especially across social media today?
With the current war going on, I think one way is to promote sitting down at the table together and talking, rather than whose fault is it. Taking sides for whose fault it was is kind of dysfunctional at this time. And that's one way in the present situation. Maybe other people have some comments too.
Well, I'll tell you what just occurred to me. I grew up in the 1960s and was part of the group that protested the war in Vietnam, and it was a youth movement. Looking at the exhibit downstairs, the youth movement in the 1930s was largely either people didn't know anything about what was going on, or it was the youth movement on college campuses, much like it is now, saying, stay out of it, it's not our problem, we don't want to help the Jews in Europe, stay out of it. It was a pro-Nazi, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic movement. And that's what you're seeing now too. And I don't. It's hard to think about giving advice. I mean, I was not going to answer this at all because this is a perpetual problem that's hurt the Jews for 2,000 years, and I don't know what an answer is.
There are different levels that make it for certain conditions that make people be against each other. The main one that I would mention is cause and effect. You step on my toe, I'm going to step on your toe, right? And now this time you would say, ask the question. Many times, who is the first one to stepping on the toe? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? We don't know. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we do not. Another factor is jealousy. Everyone wants to be the best, the better, the elitist. Someone who is doing well in life is looked at with jealousy. Well, how come they are so and I'm not? And having said that, but in the Armenian, I remember when I was a little kid in Kharkov, in Ukraine, I was just a little kid. The Armenians, who were very, very hardworking people, in a very short time, they were able to maintain their families and having them, have good life in the sense, as opposed to at that time the Russian people were not very hardworking people, some of them, and because of their drinking situations, a lot of men who would receive their pay like today and before they would get home, that pay is all used on vodka. The Armenians did well. In a very short time, it was evident, and there was jealousy created. On the same footing, also the Jewish were in that kind of category. And I remember as a young kid, in Russian, if you refer to an Armenian person, you would say Armenian for a male person and Armyanka for the female. However, the Russians coined a different version, and they called us all Armyashka, which was a derogatory way of saying someone who was Armenian. So, again, there are so many levels why people become against each other. There's lack of understanding, there's jealousy, there's the factor of power. That is very, very strong. Who is the strongest with his clout? And that is where the anti-Semitism begins. And again, you tell me, where's the beginning? Who stepped on whose toes first? And unless we as people will understand that don't step on anyone's toes, then I think we'll have a better.
There's a map up here, a map of Greece. Volos sits right there. Now, the reason I'm pointed to it, Greece is the only European country that voted against Israel becoming a state. In November of 1947, when the vote came before the United Nations, Greece voted against it. A classmate of mine from grade 1 through grade 7 or 8 is a professor emeritus now from St. John University. He petitions the Greek government every single year, every single month to recognize Israel, even though today it still stands as not recognizing Israel as a country. So, in answer to your question, sometimes we grow up with certain things instilled in us, with subconsciously and consciously, that we do not even realize it. And I'm saying this to you because it happened to me in growing up in Greece, being hated because I'm a Jew. That carried with me throughout my life. In 1964, 65, I was at Castle Air Force Base in Merced, not far from here. A good friend of mine from German descent asked me the question, which I did not know, asked me the question, how would you feel, against Germany? My reply to him was, if I was in a ball field that I knew everybody there was German, that there's nobody else, only Germans, and I had a machine gun, I wouldn't think twice of going brrrr. That was my reply to him. Subsequently to that, I found out that he was from German descent. I found out a lot about him. We're best of friends, we still see each other. And I realized the hatred that was in me. Maybe that answers your question. Because it was deep rooted. And until that, I realized who I was talking to and what I was saying and what I said, it dawned on me that that negative was carried with me until that particular day. And from that day on, I changed.
I understand how Ephraim feels, and for many years as I was growing up, I always heard, a lot of negativity about the Germans and don't buy this from Germany and don't buy that. But in reality, Germany has been one of the few countries over the many years, and certainly after the war, that has tried to make amends, has recognized what it did, tries to teach their students over obviously many years what their role was in the Holocaust so that it would not happen again. And they also are one of the few countries that have made reparations to Jews. Not always enough, but it was something. They recognized it. They tried to teach their people what their mistakes were and, tried to make amends. Their governments have certainly, improved over the years. And tonight at Temple is a movie at, what time is it, Rabbi? 7 p.m. at Temple, and the title is?
Reckonings. It tells the story of the scheme to get reparations.
Yeah, it does tell the story. Temple Beth Israel, many of you know, on Maroa, 7 p.m. Everybody is welcome to this movie this evening, and it does talk about reparations. I have not seen it, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Can I get one more round of applause for our speakers and our moderator?